Hello, my name is Berger, and this is my submission for Lab 4, Oscillations in the course Physics 2211, Dr. Claire Berger. The purpose of this lab is to predict the motion of a mass attached to an oscillating spring. First, we analyze and track the motion of a mass attached to a spring through the video tracking software called Tracker. Then, with the data from the tracking software, we were able to derive necessary data in order to predict the motion of the spring in WebVPython. Here we can see a brief preview of the results of the lab. Physics principles used in this lab are Newton's second law and the energy principle. Newton's second law is used to derive the position update formula and the velocity update formula, which will be used in the lab to predict the motion of the spring. The energy principle is used to calculate energy changes throughout the motion of the spring. The system of this lab is the Earth, mass, and the spring. The surroundings of the lab are nothing, and the initial conditions are that the mass starts at rest. And since there are no surroundings, we know that the surroundings do no work on the system, and therefore the change in energy in the system is zero. Now that the conditions of the lab have been set, we can first move to Tracker. In Tracker, we can track the motion of the spring along its motion path and record each X and Y component. With the data from Tracker, we can derive the spring constant and relax the length of the spring, simply by measuring the time between one oscillation. Here we can see the spring constant calculation. Then, with the spring constant calculated, we can calculate the relaxed length of the spring, as we know all variables to calculate such, as shown here. This information, we can code and predict the motion of our spring in WebVPython. Here are the initial conditions of the mass. See our spring constant and initial relaxed length that we calculated. Here we can see the spring's displacement. Here we can see an application of the energy principle, as mentioned earlier. Through each loop, we can set the initial energies of the system, as well as calculate the net force, which is simply the sum of the spring force and the gravitational force. Given that we know the net force, we can then update the ball's velocity as well as position. Here, we can use the energy principle to calculate the energy changes as the mass moves throughout its motion path. Here, we can see the code run. Here, we can see the changes of energy and the comparison in X and Y positions between our model and experiment. Possible sources of error in this lab include the negligence of air resistance and rotational motion, both of which would slow the motion of the spring in the observed model, which is not accounted for in the predicted model. This could be a reason as why the predicted model becomes less accurate over time, as we can see in this trend here. The principle is satisfied as the rise in one type of energy is accounted for by a decrease in other types of energy, such that the change in energy in the system is still zero, as mentioned before. What does it mean continued? Making two separate estimations of the oscillation period tau using X and Y uses a slightly different period, as you can see from this calculation. However, this slight difference in period has a domino effect, affecting the spring constant, the spring force, and the spring potential energy. This slight difference in periods can be caused by many factors, including tracking errors, as well as air resistance. And that wraps it up for Lab 2. And that wraps it up.